Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EDHRECast. I'm Matt Morgan, and I am joined by my co-host. He is the Dr. Teeth to my electric mayhem. It is Dana Roach. Dana, what's going on?
That was pretty fantastic. I really appreciate that, Matt. Thank you.
I mean, anything Muppet related, I'm on board with, so I'm glad you appreciate it.
Well, a question for you today. What's blue and not very heavy?
Light blue.
Nice.
There it is. Once again, Dana, you're really good at finding my dad jokes from years ago.
Did you do that one too?
And reusing them. I'm so happy that...
I'm recycling.
It's all about recycling, yes. Mm-hmm. That's light green with the arrows, but either way.
Yeah.
But so Dana, we are here without Joey. Joey's taking a week off. But what are we here to talk about this week?
We just did a show that was like really heavy on data here about 2 weeks back, and we want to kind of implement that. And we had a bunch of questions from patron supporters, so this is kind of the Commander Questionnaire here.
Yeah, a lot of different questions. I'm really excited to do this. We polled a lot of our patrons in our Discord server, pulled some folks on social media, so it'll be good to get into these. But real quick, we got some shout outs to do before we get into it, including MagicCon Chicago. We just want to remind everybody out there, we will be there. We'll have meet and greets on Saturday. We will have a live show going on, Dana. All three of us Sunday afternoon at 2:30. We'll be in a side room away from the main hall, but all the fun frivolity that you might expect from the show will be going on. So make sure you come by Sunday afternoon at 2:30 and our meet and greet Saturday morning, along with playing games all throughout the rest of the weekend.
And we are now probably armored up as a Knights of the Order of Dragon Shield as well. Their sleeve crafter tool at dragonshield.com is really kind of amazing, letting you design personalized sleeves for your Magic collection. It's really easy to use, and it lets you use any piece of art to make your sleeves unique to you and your deck. And if you click on the link in the description below, you'll get 5% off anything from Dragon Shield. It makes your products cheaper and it supports the show.
Yeah, it's a fantastic way to support the show. You can also use coupon code EDHREC. Awesome way to do that. But clicking on the link is an awesome way to support us, get yourself some awesome sleeves. If you are at MagicCon Chicago, you may have some opportunities to pick up some very special, some limited edition for now, I guess, Dragon Shield products, courtesy of EDHRECast, so make sure you tune in there. But yeah, click on the link for all the ways to support us through Dragon Shield.
EDHREC has also started doing a weekly interview show called What's Up, hosted by writer and editor Andy Zupke at twitch.tv/EDHREC. Tuesdays at 7 Pacific, 10 Eastern. You can stop in and see Andy interview different people in the Magic community. February's guest list includes Rebel Blue, Brouhaha Gaming, Ryan Nichols, aka Tron is Bad, and Bobby Christine.
Yep, some awesome guests, so make sure you tune in Tuesday evenings for that as well. And finally, if you would like to support the show, there's lots of ways you can do that. You can click on those links to support us in buying Dragon Shield sleeves, or you can just go to patreon.com/EDHRECast. It's a way to get yourself a nice little something back in exchange for supporting us over on Patreon, whether you want to see all of our episodes a day early. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the tier where you get to be in the running for the weekly shout out of the week to one of our very special patrons. So this week, we are going to give that shout out to RJ Ogren, who is not an ogre, not a Shrek. It is just RJ, who's honestly an awesome patron over there. So thank you, RJ, for supporting us. We definitely appreciate that so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It really means a lot and helps us do all the things we like to do every single week, whether it's going to Chicago or just putting this show on YouTube every week.
Yeah, if you would like to see more content from us, supporting us on Patreon is the best way to do that because it enables so many creators to do so many different things. So make sure you check us out over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. But with that all out of the way, Dana, we have a whole bunch of questions. You kind of talked to a lot of our patrons over in that Discord community for our patrons and got a lot of questions from the community, asked people on social media. So really, how are we going to get started? There's so many questions. I don't really know where to start. So why don't you just get us into this?
So, I'll grab one of the first ones we got. And these are all how do you questions for the most part, for whatever reason they want it being formulated that way. But the first one we got from patron supporter Umara asks, how do you handle it's not that deck players when it inevitably winds up being that deck?
Well, I want to start off and say Joey did a whole video about this. Very, very topic. So make sure you click on the link. We'll have that linked in the description below. And that's a really good way to just kind of break down everything. But everybody handles this a little bit differently, I feel. So Dana, I know you get to play in person probably the most of the three of us. You have a really good play group going. How do you handle that when that happens at your shop?
So particularly when it's somebody I don't know, I err on the side of giving them the benefit of the doubt. I would rather assume that it's actually, in fact, not that deck, and then lose the game because I played and something that was underpowered or didn't respond accordingly, and then adjust for the next game, then I would, assume the worst case scenario and then wind up stomping somebody in a situation that, they actually happen to be playing not the version of that deck. So that's first things first. That's the initial reaction I have is I go in assuming the best when they tell me that, and then adjust accordingly when it winds up still being that deck.
So if they don't have that deck and they are true to their word, do you usually give them a little more grace and leeway in the future when they're playing maybe an overpowered commander?
Yes, yeah. If I see that person again, absolutely, yeah.
Gotcha. And if they don't, how do you kind of react? Because I think that's the situation where so many people and so many players have come across where somebody says it's not that deck and it totally is that Urza deck. How do you handle that then? It's
really tricky that's a tough line to walk because it's very difficult to point that out without coming across number one, you're a poor loser because there's a good chance that you just lost that game because you gave them the benefit of that doubt and didn't respond accordingly. So it's tough. Usually I will then say, something like, okay, I grabbed the wrong deck. I didn't think this was going to be the power level we were playing at. Let me adjust. Mm-hmm. That way I can make the comment that they were playing something a little bit stronger while acting like it was my mistake.
Yeah.
That's really the most gracious way to do it, I think.
It's so hard too, because you mentioned, you don't want to come across like a sore loser.
Right.
I also think you got to be really, really careful to not come across super accusatory either.
Right.
If it turns into, well, you did this, you played the bad deck, you're going to put somebody in a corner. Nobody wants to do that. It's going to cause them to be defensive too. I mean, it's just regular conflict resolution that we all honestly should use in our regular daily lives.
Yes.
But it feels magnified almost when we're playing it in the sense of we're all playing Commander, because this is a hobby. This is a break from real life. And you want to make sure you're not putting people in and souring the entire night because of one specific game.
Yeah, it's definitely been my experience. If you frame it like, I made a mistake by grabbing too weak of a deck, they're much more likely to then make the next mental leap themselves and go, was I playing something stronger than I indicated? Mm-hmm. Versus immediately being defensive if you put it on them as being the person who did something wrong.
Yeah, let them make the connections, and you're just kind of guiding that. I like that approach. I really do. I can't remember the last time I had a really egregious situation where somebody just absolutely stomped us. I mean, I think the last time it happened, it was years ago at this point, probably because I do a pretty good job at being litigious in the pregame conversation. That's probably how I handled it. And I would say that a lot of times I don't give people the benefit of the doubt. I will be pretty strict about, okay, if you're playing Tergrid, there's not really an easy way to play a friendly Tergrid deck. I don't really give people an opportunity, and maybe that's my fault, and that's a shortcoming on my end. But at the same time, I value my time because I don't have a chance to play near as often as you do, Dana. So I maybe over-regulate on the social aspect a little bit more than I should.
Yeah, the most recent example for me, and this was actually a couple weeks back, someone had a Niv Mizzet deck, and they made the, it's not that Niv Mizzet deck comment. Mm-hmm. And then pretty quickly, I mean, I want to say around turn 5 when Niv Mizzet they had ramped him out pretty quickly, used one of the transmute spells to go get Curiosity. Whichever one lets you get a 1-drop, and did the Curiosity combo. That's there's no mistaking that it's that deck when you've done that.
That feels very intentional, at that point.
But I did that. I'm like, okay, I didn't know we were playing decks that were that fast a combo. Let me grab something else. That's on me.
Yeah.
And the person then switched to something else too, and it went pretty smoothly. So it just happened to me recently, and in that case it worked.
Yeah, I remember actually I had a situation come up where I was actually playing that deck, and I had a Niv Mizzet deck for a short period of time, and it did have the Curiosity combo. And I remember in the pregame conversation, because I thought I had taken Curiosity and all those combo pieces out so I could play a relatively straightforward version of the deck. I missed one copy. So I had one version of the Curiosity type of effect in the deck still. And I didn't want to be a liar to like somebody we just met. So I sat there with that in my hand for probably 3/4 of the game, because I wanted to make sure like I was not, being a liar myself.
Sure.
I didn't want to feel misled. So that was a funny situation where it ended up being that I was the one playing that deck.
And this is just because it's an amusing story. It actually happened to me, I think last year. I was playing my Calfey deck and someone else was playing a Niv Mizzet. And I have a curiosity in that deck that I use on Calfey just for combat damage and draw a card.
Sure, yeah.
I put it
sense.
on their Niv Mizzet as like a defensive measure. And literally the next turn, I top decked a control magic.
Okay.
Allowing me to take their Niv Mizzet and then do the Niv Mizzet combo.
Jeez.
So like I myself one time did it to someone else's Niv Mizzet. So I mean, like, it does just happen sometimes.
You're the reason that they had that Niv Mizzet deck.
Right. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So next question comes up. And so we got a lot of questions here that kind of revolved around what the new player experience. So you have a new player getting into the format. That we had so many questions that we couldn't do all of them because we only have so much time on the show. But one that I really like that stood out to me, and I want to get your opinion on this, Dana, is how do you handle gaps that are pretty vast in both experience or just buying power? And I think there's kind of two different questions within this one single question. But how do you handle it when maybe, you and I, Dana, we've been playing for a long time. At least 10 years or so at this point. And a lot of people are just getting into the game just with the massive growth of the game. So how do you handle it when your experience is just outweighing these newer players, but also maybe, again, perk of us playing so long is we got Cyclonic Rifts for 50 cents
right
back in the day. How do you handle like those big gaps in decks sometimes?
So the experience gap one actually overlaps a little bit with the first question, actually, that I don't think we have it in here because we answered it in Discord chat, but somebody asked us how we handle someone who's making a lot of mistakes in a game as well. And that, I think, inexperience kind of is part of that too. When you're someone who's inexperienced with the game, they can miss how cards work, and that can, like, given how complicated Commander is, that's the kind of thing that can happen a lot with
It happens all the time. Yeah. Commander is probably the worst way for new players to start playing Magic, by the way.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
The thing I do in that situation, whether it's experience or someone making a bunch of errors, I always like point out, particularly if they're aware, if they're like, oh, I keep screwing this up, I'm sorry, or if it becomes point of conversation in a game, I always like immediately say, Commander's crazy, complicated. I've been in pods where everyone's a judge and we've still made a ton of mistakes. Do not feel bad. Put them at ease by explaining that, like, listen, people way more experienced than you have made these mistakes. Do not feel bad about it. And that's, I found, has always helped a lot with a newer player or someone who has less experience, particularly when they're making errors or struggling with something, is just make them feel like reassured that everyone deals with this because the game is just so complicated.
Yeah. The last time that I played at an LGS, it was a couple weeks ago, there actually was a newer player that was kind of fumbling around and they realized, oh my gosh, like I could totally have done this. And it was not even 15 seconds afterwards and not anything else meaningful on the board had changed. And like, well, can I do this now? Encouraging players to just feel okay, like making mistakes. Because I think the worst thing that we can do when we're playing with somebody that's new is make them feel bad for missing something.
Yes.
And so encouraging folks to, no, do the thing. You deserve it. You got to this point. Do that thing that you were trying to do. That absolutely has made a world of difference when it comes to just new players feeling okay and comfortable with this overwhelming new game. Because Magic is huge. There's so much going on in Magic. Like I said, it's so hard to keep up with everything. And like you said, judges miss things all the time. It is unreasonable to expect new players to pick up on every single little interaction.
I remember playing on stream with Sheldon Menery, who was a level 4 judge, right after Sphinx to the Second Sun came out. And all of us, including Sheldon, got Sphinx to the Second Sun wrong and how it precisely worked.
Yeah, I remember that game.
Even judges of that level can mess up cards. I think the game's just insanely complicated.
I'm pretty sure that every single time that we got to when that card did something, Sphinx of the Second Sun, we played it differently just because Sheldon even sat there and read it. And then he read it again. And then he read it. He's like, I think this is how it works. And we're just like, yep, that's what we're going with.
Good enough. Yeah.
And years later, it's so much easier to say, it's obvious what it does because we've been able to play with that card for years. But this was right after that card came out. I very much remember that game, Dana. So I absolutely agree. It's hard to know how some of these new cards are coming out and how they're going to like function completely.
Now, how do you handle the cost gap portion of this? So like you mentioned, we've been playing long enough. We were able to get rifts for, under $1 way back in Return to Ravnica block. Whereas somebody else, that's a $40 card, and like that, they don't have the ability to have that in their decks. So how do you deal with that when that comes up?
So I self-regulate pretty well, and I know this doesn't apply to everybody, but I do a lot of, I have duels just because I played Legacy for a long time. So I have a play set of every single duel because I bought them when they were significantly cheaper than they are now. I don't play them in a lot of decks because honestly, that type of card doesn't make a huge difference in the power level. All the original duels, sure. A lot of the reserve list cards, outside of like Gaia's Cradle, which is obviously one of the most powerful cards in the format. Yeah,
what's interesting about this particular question and how this works is this has changed. This is something that's changed over the years since I've been playing. I noticed the perception of a card's price and its power level is different now than it was like 6, 8, 9 years ago. Now there's a lot more like connection in players' minds between the price of a card and the power level of a card. And that wasn't always true. And it's led me to adjust some of the things I build my decks. Years ago, you could get a Yawgmoth's Will for like under $10. And I ran them in multiple black decks just as like a bad version of Regrowth or Eternal Witness or something. Like I wasn't doing anything Yawgmoth's Win crazy with it. I was just using it as a bad Regrowth. And for the first couple of years I was doing that, nobody batted an eye at seeing that card. But as the price rose up and it became a CEDH card and like people understood the, genesis of the Yawgmoth's Win name, how everyone viewed seeing that card in the deck changed. So I quit running it because like the perception became a different thing than it once was. And that's something that like I'm consciously aware of now and try to adjust my decks accordingly. And I know people will see a certain card and like respond a certain way. And if that response is going to be one where like they just ascribe power to that card, then I'm not going to like tell them they're wrong. I just tend to not run those cards.
Yeah. And it's so hard to give a hard and fast answer to questions like budget, because budget is so subjective. Like everybody has their own stance. What might be budget for me isn't for you and is for Joey. And so it's so hard. And so one thing that I do just kind of accommodate that is, especially when I'm going out to Magic Cons, Command Fest, all those things, and week to week, even going to different shops and everything too, bringing decks along different budget levels. And obviously that kind of plays a factor too, because that requires me to own multiple decks at multiple power levels and budget levels. So there's a lot that goes into it. But for me, I try to make sure that I'm keeping just a variance on there. I have my Raga Draga deck is full of really bad commons and uncommon Eldrazi that make scions and spawns. And so that deck naturally is super, super cheap. Whereas I have my Ukim and Khazar deck that is significantly more expensive, mostly just because of the mana base, because I mean, having an underground sea, a bayou, and a tropical island makes it pretty expensive. But the perception of that, I think that's one thing that you said really well, is the perception of power there gets very, very skewed as soon as I play lands. And so it's really hard to say one hard and fast rule, because there is none, because everybody has a different take on this.
And it's easy to miss that when you paid $40 for that tropical island way back in the day or something. It's easy for you to forget how other people see that card when, like, to them, it's this mythological thing that costs, a car payment to pick up. Well, they assume you are someone who's spending a car payment buying these cards and therefore are playing at a power level commensurate with that, when the reality is you just happened to buy it when it was dirt cheap, a dozen years ago.
And that is a point where I think we can encourage folks, when cards get reprinted, make sure you buy them. I like to joke Free Fall Friday, where if you go to buy cards the Friday that a set releases, you can find some super cheap copies of those cards because everybody's trying to get rid of them. They have their pre-orders and now they're trying to sell them out. That's a strategy that I've used, that I get really, really good cards. Cardsphere is such an amazing source of cards that you can get for, I think I paid $50, not even, for the Party Tree, which is the Lord of the Rings version of the Great Henge. That was a bargain.
Yeah.
And so there's so many different ways that you can use it. There's a lot of resources out there. And so it's really, really hard to give one answer, but those are just some tips that maybe I think I've learned over the course of playing that maybe is helpful for listeners out there.
Well, like kind of tangential to this, AJ the Don asked us, how would you politely ask someone in your playgroup to dull down the power level due to the group or even opponents at the LGS? How do you handle having that conversation?
So again, kind of a two-parter here. If you have a pretty insular play group, I know that I did for a long, long time. One thing that we did, because we got into an arms race for sure, and I've told this story a few times on the show, is once we kind of got to a certain level where everybody was playing dang near CDH decks, we did a harder reset. We did what we called a pre-con league, where we all bought pre-constructed decks from the same set, and we let those grow together. And that for us was such a awesome way to reset the power level of what we were doing in any given game. There are decks roughly on the same power level. We changed a card after every single game together. And so it was fun to watch those evolve. And that was one specific thing that we did that was actually a super fun experience.
Yeah, I like that. And I've done that before too, where you do like a pre-con league and lets you, and it gives you a reset, like you said. And, and I've often found that like just that experience alone tends to make people then power the rest of their decks down.
Yeah, but it's so hard to tell somebody, to answer the question specifically and directly. It's so hard to say, hey, Dana, your Khalifi deck is just too powerful. You've been winning with it all the time. We just don't like playing against it. We don't want you to say don't play the deck, but it's really hard for me to tell you, hey, tone it down a little bit, and then for you to then take it as, well, what does that look like? What are the pieces? Because it's always easier in my experiences to power up a deck than it is to power down a deck.
And this is something also that like probably depends on what the audience is. If you're, playing with a pot of your friends in your house every week over beers, it's much easier to have one of your friends be like, hey, jerkface, tone down the power level a little bit because it's beyond what we're doing. Versus if you're playing with people that are kind of like, you see them at your shop once in a while and you think you remember their name, but you're not positive. It's different having that's a different conversation with somebody that at that level. Like, you know enough to give them a head nod when you see them at Target, but like you're not like buddies. That's a whole different conversation too. So like, the situation depends a lot too.
Yeah, having somebody at your LGS who routinely plays decks are just above and beyond what everybody else is doing. A lot of times it stinks to say, but like they might self-regulate themselves out of pods sometimes, where we had a Sliver Queen player in my LGS a few years ago, and they would only really play that one deck, and it was always way more powerful than what everybody else was trying to do. And eventually that person kind of found themselves like, we'd all sit down, everybody kind of revealing, oh, okay, like I guess we need a fourth, come and sit with us. But it was always begrudgingly, and eventually we kind of just said like, build other decks, or we don't really want to play with this deck at all, but we also we don't mind having you around. So it got to be a really, really sticky situation. It's hard. This is really hard to answer, and because it's so person dependent.
And, it depends on like to use us for an example, if you're a content creator, that's also going to change how someone responds to you saying something, right?
Yeah.
Like, a random person telling me that like my deck is too powerful for a pod is going to resonate differently than like Brian Kibler saying, hey, you're playing too oppressive of a deck for this pod. I'm like, oh man, like I'll feel terrible when someone like Kibler says it. Whereas if it's somebody I don't know, I'm going to, like, am I really? I don't think that person's making sense. Like, I don't know. It's just going to depend on where you're coming from too. And like us saying that this is how we handle it, particularly this question, coming from a content creator, someone's going to receive that information maybe differently than they would if it's just like two random people. So who knows?
Yeah.
Just try to be polite and communicate well is all I can say.
Yeah, and when I'm the one receiving all this feedback, I always like to err on the side of caution, because as a content creator, my last thing that I want is for somebody to leave a game and feel like, well, so Matt Morgan hated my deck or whatever, right. or he like came out and just like absolutely stomped me. So I will tend to play decks that maybe are a little underpowered, because I don't want to have the impression that I'm just out here doing the pub stomping thing. Like,
for sure.
And I have a couple decks that I like to bring to events. I talk all the time about my Council of 4 deck, that it's all about whatever the rest of the pod is doing. That's how good Council of 4 does. And I've built the deck very specifically to accommodate power levels, whether it's the super social, the pre-con level, or all the way up to not high power, not CEDH, but up to a more powerful type of deck.
Sure, like just towing that line. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really useful thing to have. It's like have a broad array of power levels so you can do your best to match what everyone's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dana, next question that we got coming up here is Captain Marbles in our Discord asked, how do you handle balancing your deck's power levels? How do you decide when a deck should be, quote, casual and what should be, quote, sweaty or just more souped up? And also on that note, do you think it's reasonable for somebody to build multiple versions of the same commander if they enjoy it enough to want to have two different builds, especially having different power levels? So a lot in that one question there, kind of several questions. So how do you handle just deck power levels in general? Where do you typically go?
I found it's kind of difficult to tell how strong a deck is going to be until you play it, despite what your intentions may be. I've talked about my Reki History of Kamigawa deck before that I kind of made because I thought it would be funny, and it wound up being a really strong deck. So I now understand the power level that deck plays at, and I play it accordingly. But sometimes you just can't tell till you get there. In other situations, like, okay, I have a Boros Knights deck. Well, it's Boros for one. That's a bit of a power limiter, at least if you're not using something like a Wylith commander or something. I'm playing Knights, so I'm like restricting myself to just using Knights. That's a bit of a power limiter. My win con is like through combat damage, and being in Boros, I don't have access to any overrun effects. So that deck right there, like, there's three principal things: how it's going to win, what the deck makeup is, what the colors are. Looking at that deck going in, I knew it was going to be lower powered, and once I played it, it in fact plays like a lower powered deck. So you can also sometimes kind of tell, and that's my lower power deck. That, like, if someone's playing with their precon or a just tweaked precon, I feel pretty comfortable sitting down with that deck for all of those reasons. And then once I realized it was going to be that kind of power level deck, well, then I crafted it accordingly. I didn't put a Smothering Tithe in it either, or I didn't put, I made sure that, like, the cards that feel like they belong in that really higher tier power level just weren't in that deck.
Gotcha. So when you set out to build a deck, you have just an idea for what you want to do, and you let the power level kind of go from there. You don't set out with a power level in mind.
Yeah, I usually, at least usually, but like once I get a feel for it, then I'm like, okay, do I have... I already have enough higher power decks. This one's playing lower, so now I'm going to lean into that.
See, Dana, I'm actually on the opposite side of that. So when I built my Heir Apparent deck, for example, I knew pretty early on, obviously it's a Heir Apparent deck. That kind of sets the tone for a lot of things there.
Sure.
But there's still a little bit of leeway on how powerful you can make that. So that's probably the secondary concern I have, is as I get to building the deck, I get my 130 cards in a pile and I start to brainstorm the list. Then I'll kind of narrate and find what is the power level that I like, where's the deck heading itself, and then I'll make the decision on the power level from there, instead of, well, how powerful can I make it, or I want to build a low power deck. It's probably the second concern that I have personally when I'm building a deck. So it's not so much, am I making this casual sweaty? Because sometimes the deck tells me what it wants to be doing. And the Heir Apparent deck is probably the most recent example of that.
I think the other thing that I mentioned things like Smothering Tithe, but like that's the kind of thing too. I think that once you've determined, okay, this deck is playing at this power level, then you can make those tweaks. Like, okay, well, I need a board wipe in the stack, and I have a Farewell here. Sure. But Farewell, this doesn't feel like a Farewell deck, This feels like a Wrath of God deck. Yeah. So I'm going to put a Wrath of God in here because I feel like that's the level it's playing at. Not that, Farewell is broken or unfair or anything. It's a really powerful card, but like once you put X amount of those kind of super powerful cards in a deck, then it tends to ratchet the power level of the whole deck up. Yeah. And if you don't run those, then it like keeps things feeling a little bit at a lower tier. So that's the other thing. Like you can kind of keep an eye on which one of those real game altering cards you have in the deck and just not include them to keep things safe as well.
And I think for me too, in that Heir Apparent example, I kind of had the deck rounded out, and then I was left searching for a commander to accommodate what I wanted to do. That's how I kind of figured, well, the deck kind of evolved into being a little more powerful. It wasn't casual by any means. And so it kind of got me into, well, I'm going to pick Jetmir. I want my opponents to feel like this is an honest representation of about the power level. And sometimes they're just commanders that you can't really hide how powerful they are. I think the best example, Joey's not here to say it, but I'll say it for him, is Sir Conrad. That deck is so powerful. It just has a reputation. Yeah. And so every time that we sit down, I think anybody that plays and reads that card a couple times realizes that this is going to do a lot of things. And so sometimes, like with Jetmir, like with Sir Conrad, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice by trying to pretend that it's not going to be a powerful deck. It's kind of like, this reference only means something to you and I, but a Rafik of the Many. That deck, you could not build that deck casually, because at the time when Rafik of the Many was first printed, that deck was arguably the most powerful thing you could do in the format.
And everyone knew it. So when you sat down, like there was
oh, absolutely,
everyone was aware of what power level you were playing at when you dropped that on the table. Well, and speaking of adding specific cards to your deck, why don't we challenge a few stats here? We tend to talk about all the statistics on EDHREC, and sometimes those stats don't necessarily reflect how good a card is in a deck.
We love to optimize our Magic decks, but are you ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well super easy. They're dietitian approved and ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes, so you can fuel right and feel great. My husband and I have been getting Factor meals for a while now. They have a high-protein smoky Gouda chicken that is just excellent and that I don't think I can live without. I look forward to that delivery every single week. And since we're both pretty busy dudes, having something so quick and hassle-free makes lunchtime so much easier. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week, it's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals. Choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Factor can help you feel your best all day long with wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks, and even more add-ons. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that can't be beat. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/EDH50OFF and use code EDH50OFF to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code EDH50OFF at factormeals.com/EDH50OFF to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box.
Over the course of making video content, keeping up appearances has become more and more important. That's why we are so excited to partner with Geology to bring you this video. Geology has won numerous awards for their simple and effective skincare routines with over 10,000 5-star reviews. The biggest endorsement I can give is what my co-hosts themselves have pointed out. We usually only see each other via webcam, so when my co-host says, "Matt, you are glowing," you know that their products are actually working. All I did was take a quick 60-second quiz to find out what products my skin needed, and they gave me the exact lineup for the perfect skincare routine. If you need an upgrade for your skincare routine, Geology is the perfect solution. And if you're still using that same 3-in-1 product to wash your face, first off, stop. We know that you're not getting enough sleep and the dark circles under your eyes aren't going to solve themselves. Thankfully, Geology has everything you need in one easy package to take control of your skincare, including the under-eye cream that just has been helping me so much. There's no reason to wait. Head over to Geology/EDHREC70 and get 70% off your personalized skincare. As a special bonus, you'll also get 50% off special add-ons just for our listeners. Once again, that's Geology/EDHREC70 for 70% off. That's GEOLOG.IE/EDHREC70. GEOLOG.IE/EDHREC70. So let me start us off with challenge stats this week. So we had a user in our patron Discord, Jay Fiskey, had a phenomenal challenge for one of my favorite cards, and I'm so glad to see this still popping up. So Jay Fiskey in the challenge stats channel that we have said, "I've got a challenge for Hazel of the Root Bloom, a precon I've been having a lot of fun upgrading recently, and there's a card that's only showing up in 70 of the 5,000 decks, and that card is Throne of the God Pharaoh." So everybody out there, there's a fantastic synergy. So Hazel the Root Bottom is the Golgari Squirrel Druid. That's 2 in a black and a green. And it has the ability where you can pay 2 life and tap it, and then tap X untapped tokens you control to add X mana in any combination of colors. And at the beginning of your end step, you create a token that's a copy of target token you control. If that token is a squirrel, you instead create 2 tokens that are copies of it. So this is a fantastic way to get a bunch of tokens tapped in mass just for tapping Hazel and paying 2 life. And then Throne of the God Pharaoh is a card that I've played in many, many decks. Throne of the God Pharaoh is an artifact for 2 mana that says, at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So normally you look at Throne of the God Pharaoh and you think, I have to attack with a bunch of these creatures, or I have to play a bunch of mana dorks, a bunch of land or elf type of effects. But Jay Fiskey goes on to say, Hazel wants you to be pumping out tokens and turning them sideways for mana, and she helps you by pumping out scrolls at a very high pace with cards like Chatterfang for assistance. In my experience, that means at the end of my turns, I have a lot of creature tokens that are tapped through Hazel, or plus Hazel herself tapped, and Throne of the God Pharaoh helps turn this engine into incidental life loss for each opponent for just 2 mana up front, which makes it great in the early game and a potential win con in the late game. I love this challenge. Throne of the God Pharaoh is a card, like I said, I've put into so many decks, and I'm always happy to see folks bring it up where it's a really, really good opportunity with a newer commander. So, 1% of Hazel decks out there are playing Throne of the God Pharaoh. This is so, so powerful. So make sure if you want a nice little bump up in power, check out Throne of the God Pharaoh just for any type of deck that can get things turned sideways pretty easily. But yeah, Hazel is a perfect home for this. So thank you, Jay Fiske, for the challenge this week.
My challenge this week is for the enchant land spell that's only seen one printing back in Odyssey, Chamber of Manipulation. It's 2 and double blue, and like I said, it's an enchant land, and it has enchanted land has tap and discard a card, gain control of target creature until the end of turn. So you spend your 4 mana, attach it to a land, tap that land, gain control of a creature till end of turn. It's only in about 3,000 decks in EDHREC, and it's only in about 3% of Marchesa the Black Rose decks. And why it really shines in Marchesa is because whenever creatures put into the graveyard that you control, return to the battlefield under your control at the end of the turn. Chamber of Manipulation only lets you gain control of the creature, but once it's put in the graveyard and then comes back with Marchesa's ability under that player's control, the end of turn clause on Chamber of Manipulation is no longer relevant. So then you can use it next turn to take control of something else. Marchesa decks tend to be filled with a bunch of sacrifice outlets. So basically every turn that lets you take control of a creature, use your sack outlet for some kind of benefit, keep control of the creature permanently, and then you use it again next turn. There's a lot of decks where it's solid. It gives you a discard outlet, which is really, really useful in plenty of situations too. It's just a weird old card, and there's plenty of really specific niche commanders where it shines, and I think a lot of folks just don't know exists. So if you're playing one of those decks, Chamber of Manipulation is really solid. And if you liked any of the cards mentioned here on Challenge of Stats, you can get them or any cards you need for a deck at cardsphere.com, the best way to turn unplayed cards into played cards. You can add funds to your Cardsphere account by either sending out cards you don't need or by depositing funds directly, and the cards you want will get sent to you at the price you set. Cardsphere, your decks become top tier thanks to Cardsphere.
All right, Dana. So getting into the second half of these questions. So a lot of the questions that we answered in the first half were kind of deck building questions, things about ourselves and how we approach that process. So we have a whole bunch more questions, but they're going to be more on the social side of the format, talking about how to interact with others a little bit. And I'm really curious to see some of these answers you have cooked up here. So the first question we have comes from user Han Shot First, which is true. Han did shoot first. But they asked, how do you pick decks to bring into unknown play scenarios like a new LGS or a con? And also, if you travel for work and potentially have the time to play, how do you choose those decks as well?
So the con portion of this, I'm the worst person to ask this question of since I tend to bring way too many decks to a convention.
Overpack is a good way to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. So don't do what I do and bring 10 decks to a Magic Con. That's a terrible idea and your back will hate you.
Yes.
I think the correct answer for almost any of these situations is 3 or 4 decks. Bring a low power deck, bring a higher power deck, bring a deck that you just really enjoy playing, and bring a deck that I think that you think everyone else would really enjoy playing. I think those are like the 4 quadrants I look for if I'm traveling, because a lot of times, friends and I will take a day trip somewhere and we'll intend to stop at an LGS and play a couple games. Mm-hmm. We just did that a couple months ago, went to Upper Michigan and hit a store in a small town. And I brought 4 decks. Like that was what my thought process there was, and it seems to work pretty well for those kind of situations.
Yeah, I know Joey did recently do a video back before MagicCon Las Vegas, but the advice still holds true of just things to bring to Magic events. And a piece of advice that Rachel Weeks, friend of the show over on Command Zone, has kind of said, and I've really latched onto this lately, is the way that you approach what decks to build, or what decks to bring, I should say, is something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. And blue being just something very, very powerful. Sure. It's very easy to remember, especially for those of you out there who are married or engaged. And yeah, that piece of advice really, really influenced me. And I underpack. I don't want to bring decks that are just going to sit at the hotel. And I find myself I'm playing maybe 4 games a day because games can be long. Mm-hmm. I also need time in between games to get water, to go look at the play floor and see all the different vendors that are set up there. So it's really, really easy to get carried with bringing too many decks. So I've said, just in general, I will never bring more than 4 decks on a plane with me whenever I'm going to an event. That's just something that I know I'm not going there only to play. And if you are going to just play and you need to bring 5 or 6 decks, I totally get that. But I really like that piece of advice from Rachel where bring 4 decks along a different spectrum. So bring an old deck, a new deck, a deck that maybe has an idea from somebody else that you were inspired by, and then a powerful deck.
That's the best way to do it. 4 decks, maybe 5. You just more than that will just cause you more problems than it solves, I think.
Yeah, I think that people very much, they want the option of playing any given deck, but so oftentimes if I bring 4 decks, I might play 2 or 3 of them. I'm usually having a deck that I don't get a chance to play with anyways. So I just want to encourage everybody out there, don't get carried away. Don't bring too many decks to an event. And then the second question here, if you travel for work and have the time to play after hours, how many which decks? So I used to travel for work quite a bit. I was not quite a traveling salesman, but I spent a lot of time going around the country, doing a lot of different trips for business. And I kind of got by because I would go to local shops and I would go find a different play group every given day almost. And so I also still kind of kept maybe 2 or 3 decks with me. I was playing a lot of Modern and Standard back then too. So a lot of it kind of got influenced by that, where I might bring a Commander deck and then I brought a Modern deck. And that was sometimes it. It just kind of depends on the nature of the trip. But Dana, I know you got to travel a little bit for work. Do you still get to do that?
Again, I don't do it much anymore, but I used to, I'm getting sent to Ohio for this thing for a week and I'm going to have 3 free nights. Mm-hmm. What else am I going to be doing in, Columbus, Ohio to entertain myself? So I would usually, what I would do is look and see, okay, what LGSs are within, a reasonable drive from where I'm at. Mm-hmm. Do any of them have a Commander night specifically? I tended to look for, this one does on a Wednesday and this one does on a Thursday. And I've got nothing after 5 o'clock, both of those 2 nights. And, nobody I know in the area. So I'll just go to those stores and wander in, and I always had good experiences doing that. I did it in Denver. I've done it in Columbus, Ohio. I've done it in and a handful of other cities, Akron, Ohio, just a bunch of different places. And it always worked out well for me. And
sometimes too, if you can't bring decks, most shops will have drafts going on. There's always, if you have 3 or 4 LGSs within a reasonable distance of wherever you're at, chances are one is doing a draft that night. Yeah. There's just a pretty good chance. And so that's always a good way to get your magic in, get some new cards, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It is fun to play your decks, but sometimes you just don't want to bring decks, especially when you're traveling for extended periods of time. So I totally get that too. So hopefully that's helpful for Han out there.
So kind of a similar question here. We were asked, how do you handle finding a play group? This one's really tricky. And so the first thing I will mention here is when I first started playing Commander, and we're talking 10-ish years ago, I had one friend that played, and the 2 of us built Commander decks, and we played 1 versus 1 for a while, and we wanted to find some more players. None of the shops in town had a Commander night or anything going on for Commander. So what we did was, we're like, well, neither of us had anything going on Tuesday nights. So we just went to this LGS and went in and sat down at a table and played our 1v1 with one another in this shop on a Tuesday night. And, at some point talked to the shop owner, and he's like, well, yeah, if anybody else asks about Commander, I'll tell them you guys are here. And, 2 weeks later, 2 other guys came in, and 2 weeks later, 2 other guys came in, and the play group now in this town on a Tuesday night, we've got 80 to 100 people that come into the LGS to play Commander. So that was just from us showing up at the shop and telling the game store owner that we're going to be there every week on a Tuesday, and the word got out at the shop, and it just turned into a thing. Now, I would imagine today most stores have their own Commander night, but it's usually like just look around you, find an LGS near you, see what they have advertised, and show up. Yeah,
the big thing that you can do to help yourself is when you go to a new store, or maybe a store opens, talk to the staff there and say, hey, I want to play Commander. I've got this new Zayatora deck that I want to try out. But yeah, just talking to the staff and letting them get the word out for you, it takes a lot of pressure off, because sometimes you don't have the social bandwidth to grow a play group by yourself.
Another thing to look for too is see if your town has a subreddit. I'm in a college town of about 70,000 people, so it's like not that big of an area necessarily. And I happen to keep an eye on our subreddit in town just for anything interesting that would happen. And I see a post every couple months of someone like looking for a Magic playgroup or something just in the local town subreddit. And people are always really good at like responding and saying, try this LGS, try this or whatever. It's worth checking your local subreddit, particularly if you're in a town that like isn't massive, and to see if anyone's made posts or make a post yourself.
Yeah. And the big thing too, especially if there is an established playgroup that you're just trying to find the right one, the only way you can find out is to go play yourself. Go to those, and it requires a little bit of being a little bit of an extrovert, and sometimes that's a challenge. Like I've become significantly more introverted over the years compared to how I was before. But absolutely, you just sometimes have to put yourself out there. Go in, sit down. Hey, what are you guys playing? What's everybody doing? And just kind of going from there, and being flexible. Kind of, maybe a little bit shields up at first. Don't get your hopes up too high, but just kind of ease into it. Give yourself a little bit of grace, and just put yourself out there. That's the biggest piece of advice. And I know it's a little, like I said, a little bit of a struggle for some people, but that's going to be the best thing you can do is just be present, be playing. In Dana's instance, nobody's really playing. Let the shop owner know, hey, I'm going to be here if you want to tell more people, and then kind of go from there.
Another question we had here that we've talked about a little bit in the past is how do you handle burnout or FOMO? And this is, I think, one that you've been hit with, especially, Matt, like just the sheer amount of product and the sheer amount of stuff we've had to deal with. It's pretty easy to feel like you're either being burned out by all of it and just demanding your attention constantly, or feeling like you're missing out on stuff. How did you wind up dealing with those different feelings when you've had to deal with them before?
So, burnout happens on so many different levels. Like I'm lucky enough to get to do this full time. Joey and I both work for EDHREC full time. And sometimes you just kind of have to take what you can get. And so I know Outlaws Thunder Junction with Magic the Hattening and Murders at Karlov Manor with the Clue set and everything going on there. Those two sets really weren't for me. I wasn't really a big fan. It just didn't resonate with me. I know a lot of people did, but it was really hard for me. And we're currently in the middle of Aether Drift previews right now. And again, Aether Drift is kind of the death race scene isn't quite my speed, pun intended. Yes. And so for me, it's kind of making sure that I give myself a little bit of space to step away. And I don't have to pay attention to everything on a personal level. Now, making content, absolutely I do. For work, I have to pay attention to kind of what's going on and staying, up to date. But on the personal level, I don't have to put these cards in my decks. That's one thing that I would say more players than not kind of get caught up in is like, well, this new card's out. I have to put it in decks. I have to find room. No, you really don't.
Sure.
That's one thing that a good friend of the show, Olivia Gobert Hicks, has always been telling me. Whenever we're talking, I'm like, oh man, I really want to put this in a deck, but I just don't know what to do. She'll lean in and just whisper, just don't put it in a deck. You don't have to. And that piece of advice, just with burnout, with trying to update decks all the time, has taken so much weight off my shoulders.
That is really good advice, because you don't have. This is a casual format. You can just not put the card in a deck. Well, in theory, I struggle with that. Absolutely. One of the things I have found that's been very effective for me is to kind of have a plan. Like, Innistrad Remastered is coming out. Well, it's all reprints. So I can just not care, right? Like that's a preview, we have a week long where like they're previewing cards every day, what's getting reprinted, and there's new arts for all of them and new, borders and new whatever. And I'm like, I can just ignore that. Like, I have to be a little bit aware of what's getting reprinted or something if it affects pricing or whatever. But like in terms of my own deck building and my personal engagement with the game, I can ignore that. Or when a new secret lair pops out with some new treatment for cards. Well, I don't care. Like, right. I all I'm concerned about for the most part is like cards from my deck and how they play, and the treatment doesn't really matter.
Yep.
Well, I can just tune that out too. So like there are some things that I've made the conscious decision to just tune out entirely because it doesn't impact me at all.
Yeah. The secret layers are super easy for me to mentally just write off. I don't really care about a lot of different treatments, stuff like that. So for me, and I know a lot of players, they love secret layers, and that's awesome that they're able to engage with the game there. But for me, that's at least a time for me to handle that burnout that we're being asked here is, okay, I know what I want from the game, and I'm able to manage that and kind of set my own expectations from there. That's something that's absolutely enormous when it comes to, making sure you're not burnt out. Feeling obligated to include everything, that's just unsustainable these days.
Well, so Thunder Junction's a good example that you mentioned. That came out at a point in time when my personal life was very, very busy. I just had a lot of things going on that I was dealing with. But I still, wanted to look for what cards I would want for my decks, and I needed to keep abreast for, EDHRECast and my job. Well, rather than pay attention to preview season, that was a set where I'm like, oh, I'm just going to tune in once the cards all drop on Friday, and I'm going to spend an hour and a half going over the list of all the cards and like, okay, these are good. These are ones I can ignore. These are ones I want for decks. And that's it. So like, even if it's a set that you want to pay attention to, you don't have to participate in the 2-week spoiler season or anything. Like you can just say, okay, well, when the set's out, I will then look and see what I want for my decks, order a few singles, put them in decks and be done. Like you can also engage in that way. You don't have to engage in the way that like Wizards wants you to engage, where you're constantly paying attention to new product. You can set those parameters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate you putting it that way. So one thing too that I want to ask, because this is another question that I'm really curious to hear just from your point of view, because I know you and Joey did the episode towards the end of last year about compiling all of your data. You recorded all of your decks and all your games. How do you handle it when you're on like an extended win streak or losing streak? Does that impact your deck building process at all? Does it impact the decks you bring to game nights? Does it matter at all to you?
It matters less now than it probably did, years ago, where I would come back from Commander Night and lie in bed being like, man, that deck just didn't work right. What changes do I need to make? Like, I remember that coming home from Commander Night, and as I'm lying in bed in the dark, before I fall asleep, replaying things in my brain. Yeah, this deck just needs more removal and it needs more draw, and I need to, okay, so what cards, like this card hasn't worked in 3 weeks in that deck. So I'm going to replace it with another removal spell because I feel, I did that obsessively after Commander Night. I don't do that anymore because if I've lost a few games, I've lost a few games, and it is what it is. So it affects me less than it once did. The other thing though that I have noticed is when things do impact me negatively, it's almost always not really about the game. It's usually about something else.
Yep.
And the game is just magnifying that. Like, I lost 2 games and it really rubbed me the wrong way tonight. It's not because I lost 2 games. It's because I just had a really stressful day at work, and anything I would have done after work that wouldn't have gone perfectly would have rubbed me the wrong way. So it was the external stress, and the losing the 2 games bugged me because of those external factors. And I don't know if I was maybe aware of that as much as I was, once upon a time too. So nowadays I'm much more alert and aware, like, this is because I have low blood sugar, or it's because I had my personal life is very stressful right now, or whatever. So that I'm also like very aware of. How about you? Is that something that you run into, or like you particularly losing when you've lost a couple games and it like impacts you in some way?
So honestly, I've been playing for the experience for so much that I don't really care so much about the wins or the losses anymore. I'm focused on, do I get to do the thing? Do I get to have some sort of impact on the game? And that's where I really make sure I'm focusing on, because wins and losses, that there's so much out of my own control. And I played for wins and losses for so long that mentally I had to shift my kind of expectations and what I wanted from the game. I had to shift away from that. Just so it's not that I don't care about winning, because winning's always fun. Everybody loves to win games.
Yeah.
But I've made sure that do I get to make an impact? Do I get to contribute to the game and do the thing I set out to do? And even when I lose, if I get to do that big splashy thing, if I get to resolve a last march of the Ents, that game is going to be memorable for me. And so finding ways to create memories, that's been my big shift that I've had to take mentally. That's really taken a lot of pressure off not caring as much about the win streaks and the losing streaks. So I don't engage with the game the same way that you and Joey do about tracking games, keeping all that data. But one thing I do still keep track of is, does this deck spark joy? Does my Council of 4 deck still make sense for me to have? Does this new Jetmir deck with all the Heir Apparents, did that play the way that I wanted to? Did I enjoy playing it? So those are more the questions I end up asking myself after games, more so than did I win, did I lose? So just making that paradigm shift for myself, that's been significantly helpful when it comes to just me analyzing games away from the wins column and losses.
Well, talking about decks sparking joy, then that leads us to the next question we have here. How do you handle culling decks? So like, what triggers you to realize like, okay, it's time for this deck to go, or just the general point, like I have too many decks and something has to go. How do you make that decision? What triggers all that?
So, I mean, culling decks is really hard to do. This is probably the hardest question for me to answer because I am a hoarder. I accumulate decks, and it's really hard for me to get rid of decks. But so I recently have gotten rid of a few, and I've taken them apart. I've pieced them out, mostly because, okay, well, I have a Smothering Tithe, I have an Anointed Procession in this Taste of Karlov deck that it's literally has dust on it. And I found myself thinking, like, why do I have so much cardboard equity built up and saved in this deck that if I had to go to a game night tonight, I wouldn't grab it. I haven't updated the deck. I haven't felt the urge to. And so that really sparked me. And this happened very recently, actually, where I started piecing apart decks that I had asked myself the question, if I had a game night tonight, would I want to grab this? And there were other decks that kind of fell to the wayside, but it was actually kind of a relief because now I have 8 more deck boxes to store things in. But I was able to put powerful pieces into more powerful decks and put those into decks that I do want to play. And so I've been slowly working down the number of decks. And there's a couple decks that are going to be harder questions, but I hate this process. And so it's really hard for me to answer this because I'm struggling with this at the moment myself.
Yeah, this one can be really difficult. So once upon a time, I don't know, I wasn't like doing a challenge necessarily, but like in my head, I'm like, okay, I want to eventually have one of every 2-color combo and probably one of every mono deck. So I'm like, I want 15 decks. But once I thought that, then I got it in my head that, well, I can't have another deck of the existing color combo. Like if I have a Selesnya deck and I had a Sigarda Host of Hurons Enchantress deck, well, then if I want to build something new, I can't build another Selesnya deck because I already have one, which then led me to kind of unconsciously thinking, well, I can't also take apart that deck because I want one of every color combination. And therefore, even if this deck quit being fun, I don't want to get rid of it because I've already figured out what my deck was in that color combination.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even aware, I don't think that I was looking at it that way. But once I realized I was, then that really freed me up to number one, like, oh, this cool commander I'd wanted to build, I wasn't letting myself build it because I already had something in that color combination. So it freed me up to duplicate that for one.
Yeah, and that's such a weird restriction people put on themselves because I used to do the same thing. But looking back, I was like, I was kind of letting something entirely arbitrary cut in on my ability to do things that I want to do. And I feel like that's probably a stage that every Magic player goes through where, well, I can't have more than one Gruul deck, but I really like Omnath Lucas of Rage, and I really like having a Raga Draga deck, and now I'm building Faldorn. And giving yourself permission to do things that you want to do is such a huge, huge weight off people's shoulders when they finally have that, when it comes to just building decks and engaging with the game. Yeah,
I have no idea why I was doing that to myself, but I was. So that freed me up to build a couple more decks that overlapped in colors, and it freed me up to do things like taking apart that Sigarda Host of Hurons deck that like I had just lost interest in. I felt like I had gotten too many tools in Enchantress colors, and the deck had stopped being challenging. But I still was keeping it around because like, well, it was my Selesnya deck. So I once I realized what I was doing and I kind of stopped doing that was very freeing. It made it much easier to cut decks that were no longer fun for me because I'm like, oh, who cares if I no longer have a Rakdos deck, this deck quit being fun, so I'm just gonna take it apart.
Self-imposed obligations is such a hard thing to manage and work around. So I'm glad that folks out there are kind of getting to that point too, where why would I not want to do something that brings me joy? And why am I forcing myself to do something I don't really enjoy doing? And once you get over that, culling decks becomes so much easier, I think. And I'm just talking through this question with you even now on the show. Oh yeah, I probably could take apart this deck. Why am I feeling obligated to keep this around just because of some weird rule that I set up for myself? Rules can change. You can change whatever you want to be doing, and preferences change. So remember that out there for all you listeners when you're going around trying to get rid of some decks. Don't feel obligated to keep it for an arbitrary rule that doesn't matter.
Yeah, and your memories of that deck and those fun games that deck provided you don't go away once you've taken it apart. All those experiences are still in your head. You still had those good times.
Yeah.
It's okay to take that deck apart if it's no longer fun, because you'll still remember the fun times you once had with it before, whatever things change to make it no longer a good time.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Like, it's almost like folks think that once you lay this deck to rest, everything about it is gone, but you still have those memories. It doesn't mean you didn't enjoy the deck while you had it. Because I had a lot of fun with a lot of old decks. My Mael of the Anima deck was the first deck that I ever built in Commander, and I loved that deck. And I still think about putting it together sometimes, but that doesn't mean that I won't remember all these crazy situations that I had with it. It's so fun to look back on decks like that. And yeah, you're not losing anything by retiring a deck.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of gets us through today's mailbag type of episode today. So any parting thoughts, any questions that, you enjoyed getting to talk about?
I think that mostly covers it. It was kind of interesting. We just had a show a couple of weeks back that was all data, and this was like the no data episode. So that may be a bit of a palate cleanser here for us.
Yeah, for sure.
But no, this stuff is interesting because I'm curious how our listeners answer these questions.
Yeah.
I meant, we touched on this earlier, but like being a content creator does impact how people interact with you and, how we interact with them. We're maybe a little bit more cautious than I would be if I wasn't like representing an organization like EDHREC. So I am wondering what some of our listeners' answers to these questions are, because theirs are going to be a little bit different than ours.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting just how individual some of these answers can get. So I am really curious to see what some of our listeners say. And so let us know in the comments, absolutely, just any of these questions that you think you've been struggling with, or you might have some insight. Let us know in the comments below, because we are definitely interested in hearing that. And I think with that then, Dana, let's wrap it up. So if anybody wants to find you on social media, where can folks do that?
You can find me online at Dana Roach, and I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us at patreon.com/EDHRECast, as well as at MagicCon Chicago. We'll be doing a meet and greet Saturday from 10 to noon at Table 1. And Sunday especially, EDHRECast Live will be doing a live version of Challenge the Stats, where you can challenge us from 2:30 to 3:30.
And you can find Joey at Joseph M. Schultz on most social media platforms. You can find me at Mathimus55 on those same platforms. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud Knights of the Dragon's Lair. So if you need some of the best sleeves to protect your cards, go to Dragon Shield. They have sleeves. They have custom sleeves that you can make over there. A fantastic collection manager as well. So just awesome ways to support us, going on the link below to Dragon Shield. But with that, let's wrap up the show. Thank you, listeners, for sticking with us, and thank you for submitting these awesome questions. Make sure you can send us an email at edhrecast@gmail.com for the next time we do a mailbag as well. So with that all said, make sure to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.